My name is John Hollicka, and I'm a professor of visual arts here, and I'm one of the organizers of the teach-in. And I want to start with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I stand as a grateful guest on the unceded land of the Kumeyaay Nation, and that wherever we are, wherever we live, wherever we visit on this continent, we humbly recognize that we are guests on the native lands of sovereign nations. I also want to acknowledge that as an immigrant to this land, I'm the beneficiary of a long and cruel history of settler colonial violence, land theft, dehumanization, and genocide that continues to impact the native people of this continent. As a Palestinian American who struggles against the colonization of my ancestral land, I'm deeply troubled by the irony of also being a settler on other people's native land. And I seek the guidance and the wisdom of our indigenous sisters and brothers in being a caring steward of this land. So a few brief things. This is the first event of our spring 2025 teaching on Palestine. And just a few comments for those of you that don't know. The teach-in is organized by a coalition of faculty, alumni, and students from 6 Southern California universities and colleges. The teach-in provides our communities with a series of educational and cultural events from multiple academic perspectives. And our aim is to create spaces for complex learning, honest reflection, and respectful dialogue that will encourage us to think critically about our relationships to what is taking place in Palestine. I want to thank you all for being here and for your willingness to learn and to engage with one of the most critical topics of our time. I also want to thank the members of our coalition for their work to realize justice in Palestine and for their empathy and their solidarity with the struggle of the Palestinian people. Empathy appears to be a quality that's completely lacking in all of the members and advisors of the new Trump administration. And I think we need to learn to teach that to our fellow citizens. I also want to thank USD for providing the physical and intellectual space to hold this teaching. But mostly, I really want to thank you all, especially all of the students who are sitting here with us in this audience. So since 2023, the coalition has presented 24 educational and cultural events as part of the ongoing teaching on Palestine. We've critically examined the occupation of Palestine from a number of perspectives and will continue to do so this semester. We have 11 events planned for the semester, and we're still working to finalize a few of them. And I just want to say that if you're not on our mailing list and you want to get information sent to you about each of the events, like a week or 2 weeks ahead of time, I have a yellow pad there. Make sure that you put your name on it, and I'll put you on the mailing list, please. And before I introduce our speaker, I just want to mention the next 2 events, because I've not yet sent out a calendar. So the next event is titled The Mirage of Israeli Environmentalism, Necropolitics in Water and Agriculture. And it'll be held on Thursday, February 27 from 6 to 8 p.m. in this room in Manchester Auditorium. And on March the 6th, there'll be a lecture and a conversation with Dr. Atalia Omer, Professor of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She'll be flying here to present, and it'll be from 6 to 8 p.m. in Solomon Hall, which is located in the 2nd floor of Maher Hall. Dr. Omer's lecture is titled, "We Show Up Because We Are Jews, Not Despite Being Jewish, Jews in Solidarity with Palestinians." There will also be a screening of the recently released film, The Palestine Exception, on March the 5th, 2025 at San Diego State University. And that will be in Hardy Tower, room 140, and I'll be sending out reminders. So again, if you're not on the mailing list, please do. And I'm very happy now to introduce tonight's speaker, and I'm even more happy that he agreed to present the opening lecture for the Spring 2025 teaching on Palestine. It's a very timely lecture indeed. Dr. Ibrahim al-Marashi's lecture is titled Writing History After October 7th, From Gaza to the Climate Crisis in the Middle East Future Under the Trump Administration. Dr. Marashi is Associate Professor of Middle East History at California State University, St. Marcos. He also taught at USD a number of classes, and there's probably a few students there that know him. His most recent books include A Concise History of the Middle East, co-authored with Arthur Goldschmidt, Jr., published by Routledge in 2024. And the other book that I'll mention is The Modern History of Iraq, co-authored with Phoebe Marr, also published by Routledge in 2017. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ibrahim al-Marashi. And we're live streaming right now, so I'm saying this for both this audience and the audience that's online. After the lecture, there'll be a period of questions and answers. So stick around.
Well, while I pull up my lecture, I want to thank you for coming to a presentation of a book I did not want to write. It is the 13th edition. The number 13 is often associated with bad luck, and I'm going to tell you about the bad luck that surrounded this volume. Before I say that, in terms of the number 13, it was in the year 2013. I want to thank the Kroc School and Professor Nejla Chergi, who's sitting here, who invited me more than a decade ago to give a lecture on this very stage when the possibility of Syria was about to be bombed for the deployment of chemical weapons during its civil war. It's also on this stage that on December 2024, I gave a lecture about the fall of that government in Syria. Here I am now talking about, like I said, a book I did not want to write. I'm showing this poster of the presentation I gave of this book at Oxford University. Not to flex, as your generation uses as a term, but to ask you one of my first questions. What happened on the Friday before that Monday? I'll answer towards the end, but I'm showing this poster because this also shows the perils of trying to write a history when history is being made. And that's the theme of this. How do we write a history and think about what are going to be the outcomes of this conflict that's endured for the last 15 months? This is my first question, but before we proceed any further, I want to ask for 60 seconds of silence. I take this picture from Baalbek. It was in 2022 where I took this picture of a cat and wondered since this UNESCO heritage site, the Temple of Jupiter, had witnessed intense bombings since September of last year. And I always wondered about, I used to joke that this was a Jupiter cat. I wondered, how did this cat endure those bombings? My name is Ibrahim, Abraham in English. And so in the name of my progeny, I just ask for a 60 seconds of silence, 1 minute. I have this old-fashioned clock to keep track. So if we could begin now. All right, I want to thank you. It's quite surreal when you count 60 seconds on a clock like this. I want to thank John for the land acknowledgement. And here begins kind of what doesn't get into a book, because never, since I've been teaching at USD, Cal State San Marcos is a little bit beyond the Kumeyaay Nation, a nation without a state. And of course, today I'm talking about another nation without the state, of course, the Palestinian nation. But nevertheless, you might wonder with this land acknowledgement that John read, I always include this map for another reason, but I'm going to compare this map to another map that divides the Kumeyaay Nation. And of course, I just got this image on Friday. I got this image on Friday because, of course, whether it's checkpoints that divide two peoples and a territory, of course, I'm talking about the checkpoint, whether it's checkpoints that divide Palestinians from Israelis, or these checkpoints. I want you to look at the Kumeyaay Nation and these checkpoints. And then finally, let's not forget the poster that was created by Professor Mercado as part of this series, looking at borders of grief. And so whether I look at the borders of grief here, the borders of grief here, and the borders of grief that Professor Mercado alluded to, I want you to look at the imagery of the skulls from the Day of the Dead, because this is going to set up part of what I covered in my book. I want you to look at both of these borders here. And then finally, to look at an invisible border. The me search behind the research is a term I got from Ted Falk, a professor who teaches Middle East history here. So I owe Ted Falk for introducing me to this phrase. I want to show you, unfortunately, this book I'm going to show you does not have much space for pictures, but this picture is quite important for not only this book, but the subject I'm dealing with today. Forget the alpha male in this picture. This is my first time going to Iraq as an adult in the year 2004. And what I want to show you in this picture is the following. Taking a picture of this fellow was really an excuse to take a picture of those two soldiers there. Because what is not being communicated is the following. These are US forces moving into Iraq in 2004. It's been almost a year since George Bush declared mission accomplished on an aircraft carrier, not too far off our coast here in 2003. What interests me is talking to these two individuals here. I asked them of their origins, and I noticed they could barely speak English. They came from El Paso, Texas. Of course, they're coming from the borders. And of course, what I realized from that exchange was the following. Of course, they had joined the military to be fast-tracked to US citizenship. Now, what is interesting, for them to be able to cross one border between Mexico and Texas, they had to enforce another border. You have to see what's happening here. If any Iraqi approached this highway, imagine if a country invaded us and said you can no longer use the Highway 5. And if you approach the 5, you will be shot. And you have to understand, most Iraqi fatalities occurred because of this. Just simply Iraqi drivers getting too close to the American forces. You see, that's a border created within Iraq. And I found a lot of symbolism in this picture that for two men to be able to cross one border to get into El Paso, they had to travel all the way to Iraq to enforce another border. And of course, I think of this picture in 2004, and then all these images that I'm collecting over the last weekend when you spoke of the Trump administration. Merhaba, John. I'm so glad you came, because part of this lecture is for an art historian and architect at the same time. And I look at all of these images here, and I want you to understand these were images about what's just happened over the last weekend. And I show these images to set up now the next following lecture. So when I said, look at those gulls, look at these pictures from Iraq, okay? Now, I want to tell you the story of these Iraqis in this picture here through a video. And more or less what this video is going to show, and I just want to make sure with the live sharing, you always have to make sure you can share the sound, is the following. Here is a video from the year 2003. It's February 2003. And Colin Powell had just made a presentation to the UN General Assembly requesting a UN Security Council resolution to justify military action against Iraq. Why do I show this video? Because number one, it shows the work as I do as a historian and its ramifications for my field that I'm passionate about, security sector reform. Basically, I'm showing you this video because I'm arguing that the US and the British government failed to take my lessons on the necessity of security sector reform in the following video. It's February 2003. Colin Powell has made his famous speech in front of the UN Security Council.
The government's carefully coordinated propaganda offensive took an embarrassing hit tonight after Downing Street was accused of plagiarism. The target is an intelligence dossier released on Monday and heralded by none other than US Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations yesterday. Channel 4 News has learned that the bulk of this 19-page document was copied from 3 different articles, one written by a graduate student. Our defence specialist Julian Rush has the details.
I will try to
On Monday, the day before the US Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the UN, Downing Street published its latest paper on Iraq. It gives the impression of being an up-to-the-minute intelligence-based analysis, and Mr. Powell was fulsome in his praise.
I would call my colleagues' attention to the fine paper that the United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail Iraqi deception activities.
Published on the Number 10 website and called Iraq, its infrastructure of concealment, deception and intimidation, it outlines the structure of Saddam's intelligence organizations. But it made familiar reading to a Cambridge academic.
Many of the words and phrases that it used I recalled from another context. So I searched around the other articles that I'd read on Iraq's organisations, its military and security organisations, and realised that large sections of the British government's dossier were actually copied.
Copied from here, an article last September in a small journal, the Middle East Review of International Affairs. Its author, Ibrahim al-Marashi, a postgraduate student from Monterey in California.
The document, the British government dossier, is 19 pages long. Most of pages 6 to 16 are copied directly from that document.
Word for word?
Word for word. Even the grammatical errors and the typographical mistakes are copied.
Large sections do indeed appear verbatim. This, for example, 6 paragraphs long on Saddam's special security organisation. The exact same words are in the Californian student's paper. Of military intelligence, al-Marashi writes, the head of military intelligence generally did not have to be a relative of Saddam's immediate family nor a Tikriti. Saddam appointed Sabir Abdelaziz al-Duri as head. Note the comma after appointed. Downing Street paraphrases the first sentence, but the second is cut and pasted, complete with the same grammatical error. Academics take plagiarism seriously. It's intellectual theft. Downing Street didn't ask for permission to reproduce the work, which is not current, but actually an historical analysis of the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait before the last Gulf War.
He's writing his PhD thesis on the operation of Iraqi forces inside Kuwait, and his primary source of information is documents captured from the Iraqi government in 1991. The information, therefore, that he is using is 12 years old, and he acknowledges this in his article. The British government, when it transplants that information into its own dossier, does not make that acknowledgement. So it is presented as current information about Iraq's current security services, when really the information that it is using are some 12 years old.
Downing Street copied from 2 other articles from the magazine Jane's Intelligence Review. Its editor is happy to be quoted, less happy at the selective way some parts were edited.
What you need to look at is exactly how it's been compiled and collated. And the questions that you're asking about, has certain things been selected for spin, are right questions to be asked.
In several places, Downing Street edits the originals to make more sinister reading. Number 10 says the main intelligence agency is spying on foreign embassies in Iraq. The original read monitoring foreign embassies in Iraq. And the provocative role of supporting terrorist organisations in hostile regimes is weaker in the originals, aiding opposition groups in hostile regimes.
Part of the article.
And an original phrase describing a group made up of bullies and country bumpkins is in Number 10's version just bullies. Editing to make Saddam's apparatus look more terrifying, raising questions about the way Number 10 is spinning the justification for war.
Julian Rush. Well, I called Downing Street for reaction. No minister was available, and intriguingly, actually the Tory opposition didn't want to talk about it either. Downing Street offered this statement. Our report was put together by a range of government officials. The report makes this clear. The contents were drawn from a number of sources, including intelligence material. First paragraph only, I gather. The report does not identify or credit any sources, nor does it claim exclusivity on its contents. We consider the text as published accurate. The Downing Street spokesman would not be drawn on whether this included the typos and spelling mistakes.
Okay, why do I show that video? And you could watch my TED Talk if you want kind of more details of what happened. Now, my point is this, and I'm still in the land acknowledgement, is the following. The takeaway of that research I was doing on the 1991 Gulf War, which was a PhD thesis I was doing at Oxford, was the following. What lesson can you take from history for security sector reform was the following. There were about 100,000 men employed in Iraq security services, paramilitary militias, intelligence agencies. And my argument was this. If you don't manage their demobilization, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, you're setting up Iraq for chaos. And that was the lesson that was not heeded. It's the lesson I give to the current government in Syria. It's the same dynamic. Both Iraq and Syria are Ba'athist states. About the same number of people were recruited in its security sector. If DDR, this demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration, isn't managed right, you're setting up your country for chaos. And sure enough, those members of Iraq security services that didn't go through a DDR process ended up gravitating to a group called ISIS. And that explains, you had men trained in subversion and the use of arms. That's what explained ISIS's success. Something else had to coincide. It's too simplistic to say former Ba'athists and Saddam's regime explained the rise of ISIS. And the next element I look at in my book is climate change. A lot of the Syrian fighters who joined ISIS were dispossessed farmers, okay, who had suffered from a drought in 2008. And ISIS was just simply the militia willing to give them a livelihood around 2011. It's just that simple. A good number of these men are displaced Iraqi farmers from the marshes, okay, who basically were given a paycheck by Iraqi militias who said, we desperately need you to fight ISIS because Iraq has no military. The Iraqi military was disbanded by the US after the 2003 Iraq War. A good number of these militias who loved these skull masks were displaced farmers from the Iraqi South. In my book, I say it's not too much to imagine that displaced farmers fighting for ISIS from Syria were fighting displaced farmers from the south of Iraq in the Shia militias. This is a subject I'm going to look at in a bit more detail when we talk about water and the next lecture in this series. But I just want you to look at these images, because these images were showing the Iraqi Shia militias through the frame of demonization, saying, look, look at these Iraqis who are fighting on behalf of ISIS. This is the de facto American ally on the ground. And there was a judgment being made about these Iraqi Shia militias. I took a collage of these masks, okay, to show you the following. Never would I have thought that these militias would come home. You see, when we pass judgment on militias on other countries, okay, look at the following. Militias on the US-Mexico border offer to help Trump with mass deportation plan. Okay, and I think this is why history, the need to record what's happened in other places in the past, can also teach us lessons about, are we as a society any different, whether it's militias in Iraq or militias in the US. So, this is my history acknowledgement, that studying history will sometimes make you uncomfortable. Studying history will sometimes make you feel deeply upset. Studying history will sometimes make you feel extremely angry. If studying history always makes you feel proud and happy, you probably aren't studying history. And so this is the history that's going to make you upset today. I was first assigned the 5th edition of A Concise History of the Middle East by author Goldschmidt in Professor May Sakely's class at UCLA. Okay, and the fact that May Sakely, one of the most prominent historians of history of Palestine and Palestinians, would assign a book by Arthur Goldschmidt, I realized, okay, this guy is not Arab, but definitely has enough, if we could say, street cred to be assigned by May Sakely. Okay. Author, I'm not sure, are you in the audience, and does he have the means to say hi or speak? I did send him a link, but if I don't hear from him, Arthur, shout out to you. And don't worry, if we don't get him, he could speak during the Q&A. I read this book and oh, you do see him. Author, if you're there, do you want to say a few words? I read your book in the as an undergrad, but this is your chance to speak. Let's see if we could arrange it. So my co-author, East Coast. Okay, and he's about to go to sleep. I know it's bedtime for him. In his late 80s, very sharp. Unfortunately, my other co-author, Phoebe Marr, who wrote The History of Iraq, I want to acknowledge her. In the late 80s, very sharp. She just passed away 2 weeks ago. So Phoebe as well, this is in your memory. So yes, you got an idea. When Paulo Coelho wrote a letter in The Guardian thanking President Bush, and he talked about, thank you for allowing Colin Powell to make a complete fool of himself by showing the UN Security Council photos which 1 week later were publicly challenged by Hans Blix. Thank you for making it necessary for Tony Blair to go to the British Parliament with a fabricated dossier written by a student 10 years ago and present this as damning evidence collected by the British security services. This is basically an argument that policy can't be understood without a historical context. So the 12th edition had been published in 2018, and I want to show you basically how we chose the cover. Okay. 2018, I chose the city of Mosul for the cover because it had been occupied by ISIS, and a good number of the minarets you're seeing here were deliberately destroyed by the Islamic State as it withdrew. Mosul is the city that is the home to a wonderful Iraqi architect that I knew in my lifetime. Her name was Zaha Hadid. Zaha Hadid, her architecture was inspired by the marshes. And like I said, next lecture, I'm going to be talking about the Iraqi marshes that are evaporating as we speak. And having witnessed the marshes was an inspiration for the free-flowing forms in her architecture. I'm getting this from a children's book about Zaha's life. And this is a picture of Zaha next to the Middle East Center that was built at Oxford, where I eventually was able to talk about her life. And of course, the Oxford Middle East Center took inspiration from the homes of the marshes that are disappearing due to climate change and evaporation. And this kind of shows you the building that she constructed at St. Anthony's College. And this is where I gave a speech about the 2003 war 20 years later inside the Middle East Center at Oxford, very much like the marshes homes that we see here. Zaha passed right before the Nouri Mosque was deliberately destroyed in Mosul, otherwise known as the Hunchback of Mosul. ISIS deliberately destroyed it. It was a mosque with a minaret that curves. It's just recently, it was destroyed as ISIS withdrew in 2017. And I mean, it's tragic to say that Zaha passed away right before the destruction of the mosque. And that was kind of a bittersweet acknowledgement that I'm glad she didn't get to see the destruction to her native Mosul. So that was a 12th edition. For the 13th edition, this was a book I did not want to publish, and I'm telling you why. Do you see the release date? October 7th, 2024. And I'll tell you why I was opposed to its publication. How do I write a history, but also acknowledge the number of fatalities in Gaza by the time it's published? You see, how do I calculate the rate of death so that the book is accurate by October 7th. This is what caused me problems writing it. Now, the cover for this book I chose was a city where my last name comes from, Marashi, and what is today Turkey. Okay. I chose this as the cover. You notice the 5th edition just had a color. I chose cities in peril as a theme for these volumes. What had happened in Marashi was in a single day, 55,000 fatalities due to an earthquake. The town where it gives me my last name witnessed not only 55,000 deaths, but what I didn't realize it's a city that regularly endures earthquakes, but that the government of Turkey never adequately prepared the city for. In other words, 55,000, you know how earthquakes are here. That number didn't have to be that way. This is a number due to poor construction, poor use of concrete, okay? And I chose it for that reason, okay? Because when I sent the book to the publisher in 2023, that was the greatest catastrophe the region had known. And of course, the day I sent the book to be published was October 7th, 2023. It was a Saturday morning. That was the great tragedy I was covering. And when I say it's a necrohistory, right, is this, how do you keep track of those who have died? And then going forward, this is what we call necropolitics. When you're writing a book when people are dying as we speak, how do you give an accurate number to reflect the amount of deaths between the time you send off the manuscript to the time of publication? And this is why I didn't want to publish it. So in this section called Giving Gaza Its History, of course, on October 7th, 2023, I knew I could not submit the book. I knew I could not submit the book because I had to write a future history. It sounds like an oxymoron. But this is the challenge now from that morning. October 7th, 2023, you have to realize this. You see, history doesn't exist out there. The way we write history is usually we look at salient topics in the present and then go back in the past and say, how did we get here? When I say give Gaza its history, and if Peter Beiner, by the way, is speaking at San Diego State, I believe next week, but from Greenland to Gaza, right? Would Gaza have entered Trump's imagination? Okay. What I want to do is give Gaza's history. This is the amazing thing was it took this tragedy for me to go back in the past and realize how important Gaza was to history of this region. Okay. I mean, I want you to think of problems in the Middle East. Okay. Rising temperatures, refugees, bloated bureaucracies, the inability to access wheat. If you think of these problems in the Middle East, you think I'm describing the present. But no, I'm describing the conditions that led to the Bronze Age collapse. And what's fascinating about this map, when I describe all these problems, okay, you see, it took for me the events of October 7th to go back and try to find what was Gaza's role in history. And I could go all the way to the Bronze Age, the year 1200. And there's Gaza right there, a borderland, a different type of borderland between the Canaanites and the New Kingdom of Egypt. And sure enough, let's look at how the recipe was made all the way for 2023. Here we see the Hebrews making their way to this stretch of territory. Cities that we hear of, particularly after October 7th, but the point is they've always been there. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Megiddo, which of course, if you say the hill of Megiddo, Har Megiddo, it's a place that gives us the term Armageddon. We tend to forget Armageddon is not an event, it's a place, okay? And you see its geostrategic location, it's just on the road up from Gaza. So these places, Gaza has always been there. If you look at the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire is what we call the first superpower in history for its ability to reach the Himalayas, the heart of Asia, reaching all the way to the gates of Europe and to Africa, eventually. That's what made it the first superpower in history. And do you notice before it conquered Egypt, what was its border? There's the Persian Empire, they had to conquer Gaza. It's the doorway to Africa, you see. Persia could not have reached Africa without conquering Gaza. Okay. And again now, I want you to think of Alexander the Great. And you would not realize that Alexander would have been the meh, not so great for a series of events that transpired in Gaza. Alexander the Great almost received a fatal wound during the siege of Gaza. What helped him recover? Things that are helping us recover from pain to this very day, opium, or what today we call opiates. And remember, for Alexander to be great, he had to conquer Egypt, create the city of Alexandria that bears his name. And from there, securing his flank from Africa, could march into the heart of the Persian Empire. And sure enough, if you look at the region without borders, the Greek Middle East that Alexander set in motion, the reason why the New Testament is in Greek, okay, all of this was conquered by Alexander, but Gaza was the key. And then sure enough, for the Roman Empire, right? For the Roman Empire, now I'm telling a story of empire. There's Gaza and Rome's way to the breadbasket of Rome, Egypt itself. Now, from that empire, let's go to the British Empire. And what am I saying? I'm trying to put Gaza in history, but for most of history, it was erased. This is the person who the Oxford Rhodes Scholarship is named after. And what was his great imperial vision? Cecil Rhodes, who made his money off De Beer diamonds, a vision of the British Empire that stretched from South Africa all the way to Egypt. His foot is on the borders of Gaza. This is an old map of the first British Airways route, the Airways of Empire. And you see, Gaza was a place to get from Cairo to Baghdad, to link up the empire. Gaza was a place you had to land to refuel before you made your way to the other great metropolis of Baghdad. Here's Gaza in history. And the point is, it took the events of October 7th for me to go back and see the role of Gaza in the history. Okay. And there we go. Okay. Now, the thing about, I conclude, the very last page of my book is page 461. And again, it took the events of October 7th for me to conclude with the words of Edward Said, the great Palestinian American academic. Okay. You see, and Edward Said was inspired to write Orientalism for the following reason. My interest in Orientalism began for two reasons. One, it was an immediate thing. That is to say, the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, which occurred on October 7th, 1973, which had been preceded by a lot of images. That's why I show you so much images and discussions in the media and the popular press about how the Arabs are cowardly and they don't know how to fight and they're always going to be beaten because they are not modern. And then everybody was very surprised when the Egyptian army crossed the canal in early October 7th of 1973 and demonstrated like anybody else that they could fight. That was one immediate impulse. And so in other words, it took the events of October 7th, 1973, that led to the publication of Orientalism in 1978, which transformed the field. And this is now my question. 50 years later, almost history repeated. Historians, we don't like to say history repeated itself, but it was a bit eerie that on October 7th, another event happened that took everyone by surprise. And this is now my next great question. Who will be the next Edward Said as a result of these events, or the Edward Said, if you will? Okay. For those of you who don't need a reference, want to understand Orientalism, watch Aladdin in the 1990s, the cartoon version. Okay, watch Aladdin. And I chose this meme for a reason. This meme was produced around February 2017. And again, I come back to the events that happened over a couple of weekends ago when I saw people shutting down Highway 101 during the weekend of the Grammys to protest the deportations. And why did I find that symbolic? Because just a few miles away from Highway 101 is LAX. And it was in LAX where I was protesting the travel ban of 7 Muslim countries that were not allowed to enter the US. You see the irony. On the 101, I was protesting planes that were not allowed to land at LAX, literally with Syrian refugees who had been given their visas, which just got canceled while they were mid-air. The events on the 101 last February was a different process. It was planes taking people away from the US. But I find the dynamic quite similar. For the students here, I did this. I said, if a lot of students come, I promise I'll show them this video. How to understand Orientalism. Think Orientalism can be communicated. And I'm glad there's so many visual arts students here. Even by sounds. Look at this viral TikTok video that is basically showing how does Orientalism work in our Hollywood blockbusters, particularly with this imaginary soundscapes. Movie shows Arab country, Hollywood.
Welcome, my friend. Welcome, my friend.
God damn, it's hot. I'm sweating like R. Kelly in Disneyland.
Okay, that is considered by any scholar of Orientalism the quintessential video to demonstrate the nature of Orientalism. And by the way, I found this quite interesting. My argument is the following. The genie was really one of our first, I think GPT has a precedent in the genie. Think the way you talk to Chat GPT. Okay, I thought this was a funny joke. Anyway, apparently it bombed. Okay, so on Gaza now, Trump places the Joker, and this is it. Here we are now in the present. Here we are now in the present. Giving Gaza its history from Alexander the Great to a president who probably, hey, Julia. Hi, welcome. So glad to have people from visual arts here. From Alexander the Great to somebody who probably fashions himself as an Alexander, Trump the Great. Okay, and Gaza, and here is it still in history. Other places I wanted to give a history. I find it relevant that what I'm showing in this map, in Turkish, this is called the Black Sea, this is called the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean is called the Akdeniz, the White Sea, the Black, White, and Red Sea. Because what else have we witnessed, even a little bit before October 7th? I find the Turkish naming so accurate because it does highlight that despite the categories that we use, such as Middle East, North Africa, and the Black Sea region, that these waters are very much connected. And here's where the climate demonstrates it. Talking about necrohistory, another tragic episode that got very little attention occurs right here. So if you notice the little squares I'm talking about, here's Gaza, and here's a place, okay, that doesn't get much attention, Derna, that endured a Mediterranean hurricane. Such an abnormal weather condition, we had to invent a word for it. The Mediterranean normally doesn't have hurricanes. A Mediterranean hurricane not only struck the Mediterranean for the first time in recorded history, but caused the dams in the Libyan city of Derna to overflow, killing about 10,000 people in a single night. And again, this is sometimes the duty of a historian, is to record these events, because an event in a single night, this barely got any attention. But when I talk about the region's climate future, this is what I'm talking about. Whether it's climate displacing farmers in Syria that join ISIS or the Iraqi militias, the dams could have held the weather. They were just simply not well maintained because after 2001, Libya is a country divided in half between one administration in Tripoli, the other administration in Benghazi. And so why did the dams collapse? Well, this is where we get into necropolitics. And necropolitics is this, it's the politics of condemning certain populations to a slow death or a certain death through neglect. And this is a necropolitical death. The failure to maintain the dams led to the death of 2,000 people within a single night, just because of how Libya got divided as a result of the Arab Spring. Now, like I said, we worked from Gaza, we're working down through the Red Sea. And yes, it says a lot that it was called Cerberus, the three-headed dog. And now I'm talking about how climate is affecting three waters. Finally, we get to this area here. And this is the next part of the story I'm trying to tell in my book, particularly this port here. The port facing this water is known as the port of Mocha, in English rendered as Mocha. The port of Mocha is the port where all of the world's coffee came from. Yemen had a monopoly on coffee distribution. And sure enough, the most expensive coffee to this day can be found in Yemen. Okay, but of course, it cannot compete with the coffee that is produced in Brazil, Central America, and you'll be really surprised. Where does most of the world's coffee come from? It comes from Vietnam. After Brazil, the second greatest coffee producer is Vietnam. Why is Vietnam? And again, it's for a tragic historical record. The US dropped so much Agent Orange on Vietnam that most of the country has lost its foliage. The World Bank came to the Vietnamese and say, we have a great way for you to become, to what to do with this land that was bombed with this defoliant. That is carcinogenic, by the way. Grow coffee. And that's how Vietnam became the second largest coffee. Now, what is ironic is the plants from Yemen were smuggled out of the port of Machan by an entrepreneurial Dutch businessman who eventually planted it in the Dutch colony of Indonesia. And remember, Indonesia is just a conglomeration of Dutch colonies. One of the islands is known as Java. Java, and this is why Java and Mocha are terms so much used for coffee. But of course, not even Indonesia can produce with Vietnam's production. What is interesting, this is the New York Times, by the way, a lot of these ships that are being hit are shipping Yemeni coffee because all the coffee in the world is basically a descendant of that single Yemeni plant. The Yemeni plant that grows in Vietnam is now producing beans that are being attacked. Guess from where? If Mocha was a good place to ship coffee, it's also a good place to attack ships. The Red Sea shipping attacks that really brought the US into an undeclared war with the Houthis, which exists to this very day. Now, if you look at the Houthis, right, you would look at them, and this is, again, the other image. Whether I show you the Iraqi militias, when I talked about Edward Said saying this is the way we imagine the Houthis, we usually imagine these exotic tribesmen with their daggers chewing khat with their Kalashnikovs. Here's just a joke on the internet. When I hear the Houthis, this is what I think of, for the Star Wars reference. But this is what's fascinating. Again, when I'm writing the history of this region, I literally had to ask this on a multiple choice exam. In the history of humanity, the very first human-made object to ever enter space was the V-2 rocket. What are the two actors that engaged in the first instance of space combat? I don't know if any of you watch Friends. You probably remember the episode with Houthis and the Blowfish. It was a group in the 90s, but no, it was the Houthis in Israel. Now, I want you to think about this. Technically, the Houthis are what we call in political science a violent non-state actor. But nevertheless, so I mean, go from the imagery of this, but what were the Houthis able to do? They were able to modify a ballistic missile, the Scud missile, which is a descendant of the V-2. The same technology the Germans used, the Houthis modified it. Enough so this ballistic missile was able to go into space. And sure enough, they did have some help from Iran. Okay. And how is Israel able to intercept it? For the first time in history, they launched a missile into space. It's a missile defense program that they got help with from the US, and the minute two missiles were launched in violence and were intercepted in space, 100 kilometers above our heads, even space has now become a zone of conflict. Other spaces of conflict that I look at. Again, whether it's violent non-state actors or simply the tweet of Angelina Jolie, okay? And I'll read it here. This is the deliberate, and remember, she was the honorary ambassador on behalf of the United Nations. She was an honorary UN ambassador. So we go in from Colin Powell of the UN General Assembly to the following. A simple tweet. This is the deliberate bombing of a trapped population who have nowhere to flee. Gaza has been an open-air prison for nearly 2 decades and is fast becoming a mass grave. 40% of those killed are innocent children. Whole families are being murdered while the world watches, and with the active support of many governments. Millions of Palestinian civilians, children, women, families are being collectively punished and dehumanized, all while being deprived food, medicine, and humanitarian aid against international law. By refusing to demand a humanitarian ceasefire and blocking the UN Security Council from imposing one on both parties, world leaders are complicit in these crimes. So this is Angelina Jolie's tweet. And again, why does it become a history document? This is digital ephemera. A tweet only lasts as a certain moment in cyberspace. It is when the president of a head of state now declares his opposition for a tweet. Again, we're reaching a certain point in history that I find quite fascinating. Other stories I tell about in this book, again, just bringing a woman's voice into this. The case of a swimmer known as Yusra Mardini, who also became a de facto representative of UNHCR. Her life story is told in the TV series, the film The Swimmers on Netflix. of how a boat that was about to capsize was saved by this young girl who happened to be the daughter of an Olympic swimmer from Syria. And then, of course, even an international lawyer, okay, Amal al-Alameddin, you might know her by her last name, Clooney, okay, and a survivor of sexual violence, okay, Nadia Murad, being able to get a body in the UN to document what ISIS did, okay, enforcing the first regime of sexual slavery in the 21st century by a violent non-state actor and getting the UN to investigate it was something that had to be recorded in this history. And just from a very, again, how does the history of this region get very surreal? The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria declared its formation in 2014. 2024, as I was finishing the book, was the 10-year anniversary of ISIS. So I refer to its destruction of Mosul, the Iraqi architect, Zaha Hadid, who passed away before she could witness the destruction of her hometown. Never would I thought in my history of the Middle East, and sure enough, there's an index that I would be referring to Taylor Swift. Swifties versus jihadis. Is the Islamic State around? Sure enough, when her concert had to be canceled in Vienna because of a threat from the Islamic State, that made the history. Okay, and what does it tell us? And this is why I regret the book was published just a month after the August concert. It was published on October 7th, 2024, was, of course, we had the New Year's attack in New Orleans, which I could have told you as a historian was bound to happen. And I'll tell you why. And again, this is why history is the value of history for understanding political violence. Basically, I was arguing that ISIS was a multifaceted body. At one time, it was basically, what do we call it? A violent non-state actor. By definition, what is the telos of a violent non-state actor? Is to take away the non in front of the state and become a state, right? That's what the Islamic State wanted to do, and it achieved that for about 3 years. But I argue ISIS was also a it had different forms of power, right? From a biopower perspective, sexual slavery was an act of necropolitics and biopower, okay? It also had the ability of asymmetrical projection of power. What do I mean by asymmetrical projection of power is this? It could violate the sovereignty of states through social media. In other words, ISIS preyed upon two different demographics. I mentioned farmers in Syria, but in Europe or the US, the demographics who gravitated towards ISIS were the following. And this person fit the profile perfectly. It's this. And this says a lot about our debates on immigration. If you came from the Middle East to a European nation or the US, you basically sacrificed everything for your children's future. The ideology of a Salafist jihadist group like ISIS has no appeal for you. Your goal in life is to create a future for your children. It's that second generation. And sure enough, I belong to that second generation. That is a liminal generation. And it works like this. The liminal generation has no memory of the homeland, but doesn't feel completely home in the country that they're born, you see. Okay. And as a result of the socio-demographics, particularly when we look at places like Paris, okay, Belgium, and Barcelona, the 3 places that saw car attacks, just like what happened in New Orleans. These were all people that, for all intents and purposes, were Spanish, French, and Belgian citizens. Sure, their parents were from Algeria or Morocco, but they fit this pattern. And I want you to think again of the socioeconomics. Usually they grew up in the neighborhoods of Paris or Brussels that were on the outskirts, the so-called slums, if you will, the banlieues, right? And sure enough, every one of those attackers more or less had some kind of experience with law enforcement, had some kind of record of petty crime or drugs, and usually found Islam in prison. And the Islam they usually found in prison was the ISIS version of Islam. And upon release from prison, basically, what did they tell their parents? It's your failure to teach me the proper Islam that led me astray. And now I found the true path, okay? And this is what ISIS said: if you can't come and join us in the Islamic State, and here is the asymmetric form of power, We will get you to repudiate your identity by using violence to strike against the country you were born in. And that fit the pattern of every single ramming attack in Europe during the highlight of ISIS. And we thought it was over until the Taylor Swift concert, where the perpetrators perfectly fit that pattern. One, a second generation kid from Turkey. The other one from North Macedonia. And I think we have a Peace Corps volunteer about to leave to North Macedonia. Okay. The other category they prey on are converts to Islam. 99% of converts to Islam live very peaceful lives. Some converts to Islam experience this. They get disowned from their family. Okay. And those who got disowned from their family usually find a new family in the Islamic centers in their city or town. Then even a small percentage from there who got disowned from their family not only seek out a new family in their community, but then they want to prove I'm more Muslim than this family I've joined. And a good number of those converts do that as well. The case of the New Orleans attacker, he was a convert to Islam. He was an African-American convert to Islam. What I didn't write and what I do regret is the following. As I conclude, and given that this is Black History Month, is the following. Communities that don't get representation. The Ottoman Empire had a slave trade. And here are primary sources that reflect that slave trade. In fact, there was an Arab slave trade, a Middle Eastern slave trade. These are, for all intents and purposes, Turks. Okay, Afro-Turks. And I find this fascinating. Here's Mustafa Olpak. What is he saying? The first generation has the experiences. The second generation denies them. And the third generation researches into them. Okay. Here's a woman, Aleph Karakatal. By entering into mixed marriages, Afro-Turks try to have lighter skinned children so that eventually their color will disappear altogether. I mean, this is, of course, definitely the history that's going into the 14th edition, because when I hear comments like this, when I collect comments like this, I think of this painting from Brazil, Ham's Redemption, 1895, where the grandmother, now you have to just realize in the history, Brazil has larger populations of African descent than most African nations. There's a saying, no Angola, no Brazil. Here's the grandmother. And why is she praising? Because her daughter of mixed ancestry married somebody of whiter complexion, and their baby's completely white, you see. And I think about these kind of comments here. Right? If I could think of a population that represents intersectionality without taking Khalid's words, it is next lecture, I'll be talking about Afro-Iraqis, because the Afro-Iraqi population is a population that disproportionately suffers from climate change. Desmond Tutu, before he died, he coined the term climate apartheid. And I think the Afro-Iraqi population is a very good demonstration of this. Afro-Palestinians, who had a different history. They didn't come through the Ottoman slave trade. These were African Muslim pilgrims to Jerusalem who decided to stay. And most of them live in Jerusalem, right? And of course, you have to realize when they talk about double racism, the double racism works like this. Not only do they face racism in Israel, but amongst Palestinians themselves. Okay. And if I could look at a woman who could I think of a Palestinian who suffers? Number one, Nasreen Salem, being a Palestinian, being a woman, being Afro-Palestinian, and this is the case, being a journalist as well. And just to kind of show you these spaces, Afro-Palestinian centers in Jerusalem, what they look like. Okay. So, as I conclude, what happened on the Friday before I got to Oxford? Yahya Sinwar was killed. Yahya Sinwar was killed. Now, again, as a historian, why do I refer to this? Because as a historian, and I'll talk about this during the Water lecture, how did Yasser Arafat's Fatah faction reach the attention of the world in 1964? His very first armed attack was on a water diversion facility in 1964. The first attack of his Fatah faction was on a water diversion facility. Now, the whole point I argue is you attack these facilities not because you think you're going to end Israeli water policy, but to get attention of the media. And sure enough, he eventually got the attention of the world's media. This is what you use violence for, right? But I look at Yahya Sinwar's death, and I think of another death that I covered. And that was the execution of Saddam Hussein. Okay. You see, what did they say of Saddam and Yahya Sinwar's death? And now I'm talking about another battle, the battle for memory, because that's all what history is at the end of the day. Even Yahya Sinwar, he had an arm blown off. When the drone approached him with the remaining hand, what did he do in the ultimate moment of defiance? Still able to throw a stick at the drone. And what did they say of Saddam's final moments upon being hanged and when he was being tormented by his executors? He still took the death in a stoic manner, screaming back at his executors, again, defiant to the very end. Okay. So now coming to a conclusion, and this is not in the book, but it's just something that makes me think about the following, what I've tried to do in my lifetime as an individual to understand my work as a historian. When I publish a lot in the media. And it's an uphill battle. And I refer to this, I'm using the terminology that of Plato's cave and the matrix, right? There's two kinds of media we consume, and the vast majority of the media consumed follows into this category. We can't escape it. We cannot escape it. Conflict media. The word, what I call resolution media, and sometimes I try to break up the words to make you realize something. What is in the resolution? It is to find a solution, a resolution. I want you to ask, since October 7th, with the mainstream media that you have consumed, ask yourself this, which category do they fall in? Do they focus on conflict, two parties, one goal, and winning? Or explore causation, goals, and issues of both parties, okay? I look at number one because, again, I remember Edward Said's words that saying when he tried to go on the air as a pundit during the 1991 Gulf War, the soundbite structure of the media prevented him from doing number one. This is one of his great complaints. Does our media portray it as us versus them, rather than giving voice to all parties? Do we see them as a problem in one set of media versus see conflict, war as a problem? Does one set of media naturally dehumanize versus humanizing all parties? Does one set focus on combat versus focusing on peace efforts? Does one set of media focus on our suffering versus focusing on all suffering children, women, the vulnerable, animals, and the environment? Okay, that's a good question. I want to show you an article I wrote in the Washington Post that got me into a lot of trouble. And I show it just as a reminder that you can be a Muslim and fight anti-Semitism at the same time. When I wrote this article, what had just happened? And again, because now I'm thinking, you know, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Okay. This was a person who basically took an assault rifle and entered a synagogue with the intention of killing as many people as he had bullets. Afterwards, he wanted to do the same in a mosque. He was an equal opportunity racist. And it's sometimes with this hatred, this is what I wanted to highlight, that a Muslim could object to somebody who is obviously, that there are forms of anti-Semitism that are also anti-Islam at the same time, and it has to be called out. What's this guy's background? He was a student at Cal State University, San Marcos. He was somebody I could have walked by on campus. And what was he studying? Nursing. And now this is the question I want to ask. How does a person who wants to go studying nursing to save life, how does he end up taking an assault rifle, wanting to kill both Jews and Muslims? This is what I explored in this Washington Post article. Now, the story is this. As a historian, I mean, most of what I do at Cal State San Marcos is teach world history surveys, the history of 500 to the present. And of course, when I look at the big picture, what do I get as a historian? And this is, you know, just kind of the, you know, there are other forms of identity as a historian. When I argue what is one of the, I mean, in the last 500 years, right? The climax of this class, in terms of kind of just the history of humanity, what am I most passionate about is the horrors of the Holocaust. Okay. And it's also just a reminder, okay, that yes, as a Muslim Arab, you could teach the horrors of the Holocaust to an American audience, at least at that campus, that is very apathetic. That is very apathetic. What did a good number of my students at Cal State San Marcos? They objected to this poster, saying at the end of the day, you're criticizing our right to bear arms. You see, yes, exactly. And that's the objection, to the point where I have students coming into my classroom wearing t-shirts with the Statue of Liberty with an assault rifle to send me a message. How dare you write that article? Okay. And I tell you this to appreciate what you have on this campus, right? We often say civil society is dying, but it's these kind of teachings that on this campus, you do have a civility society that I do respect. I would be worried about giving a lecture like this on my campus. Where was I on October 7th, 2023? When I finished the book, I was writing to an Israeli historian named Yoav Alon, okay, who I had just cited, who we were both classmates at Oxford. We were both students of Avi Schleim and Eugene Rogan. And again, just to show you that sometimes the categories that are imposed upon us, right? I just want to show you spaces that get ignored, okay? A Muslim Arab who's passionate about teaching the Holocaust, who on the morning of October 7th, I had just sent him an email saying, when are you flying in? I'll pick you up from the airport, realizing you're not going to make it to the airport, okay? To basically demonstrate some of these spaces. Where do we go from here, okay? Is to raise awareness of these spaces, that at the end of the day, despite our differences, our loyalty was to the history. This is what united us. Okay. So let's conclude. All good things must come to an end, even history books. Now, this is the question, where do we go from the future? Right? I'll just read it from here. Who knows what a future reader will see as having been the major Middle Eastern events from the seismic events of 2011? By the same token, will an incident that we now view as a major event seem trivial by 2030? Yet it seems the consequence of the events that began on October 7th, 2023, will reverberate for generations to come. And let me just put it this way. One of my, and I see a fellow Turkish student here, Ali Merhaba. One of my passions for over the summers is running sessions between Armenian and Turkish students. And despite the mass violence that occurred in the year 1915, those tensions are raw. Those tensions are raw. That was 1915. Okay, that's all I can say. My last question to you, my last quiz. This is missiles coming, flying, streaking over the skies, being intercepted. When was this, if I'm not mistaken, this is Tel Aviv. When was this picture taken? When was this picture taken? Couple of guesses. October? The Iranian strike, good guess. So we have two contenders. That would be April 2023. It could have been October 2023. Okay, very good. That was a trick question. It was the skies of Tel Aviv, 1991, the Gulf War. Now, why, again, when I look at when I say what kind of media does our article, what kind of, when we write for different columns of the media, what was I writing about? Was in this case the following. In the summer of 2000, I was in Jerusalem taking a taxi to the airport. I was taking the taxi to the airport. And when I got into the taxi, the driver, of course, is curious about his passenger and asks me, where are you from? Okay. I say I'm from Iraq. And the driver asks, are you Iraqi Jewish? And I say, no. And from that point, then he switches into Arabic. Okay, you see. And then he goes, where in Iraq are you from? And I say, Najaf. Okay. Without having to go any further, he knows my sectarian affiliation. The minute you say Najaf, it's hard to imagine a country like this. But if imagine, if Oceanside was Buddhist and Vista was Hindu, right? You couldn't imagine a situation like this. But when he knows Najaf, Iraq, He knows I'm a Shia Muslim. And basically, this is all he had to say. I know you don't like Saddam. He's just assuming. It's a pretty good guess. Yes, Saddam is the one who sent me fleeing to the US, at least my family. I know you don't like Saddam, but I love Saddam. Now, why I was asking, he's Palestinian, of course. And I was asking, why do you love Saddam? This is in the summer of 2000. And he goes, Saddam was the only Arab leader who ever stood up for us. Saddam was the only Arab leader who ever did anything on behalf of the Palestinians by striking Israel with those Scuds. At that moment, I realized two things, and here are the two things. And it says a lot, because when I met Yoav, it was just at a very interesting time. Okay. It's the following. Saddam Hussein lost the 1991 Gulf War, but he won the war for Palestinian memory, you see. This is what I found fascinating. And I also realized something else, and this is why kind of collecting these stories are also just very good for this, combining the humanities and peace studies is this. I noticed there's something wrong. There's something wrong with that comment, and the comment is this. This is not a Palestinian who is confident in the peace process by the summer of 2000. And sure enough, what erupted literally by the time I got to Oxford in my first year of Oxford, and by the time I met Yoav, what erupted that summer? The second Palestinian Intifada, you see. And so you might now ask yourself, where are we going in the future? And this is what I wonder. And you might ask, and again, by this logic, I'm just trying to teach you a different logic of memory. You might ask, why would Hamas have conducted these actions? But based on that anecdote, and sure, the amount of destruction that was put on Gaza. But this is what I'm wondering. At the end of the day, is this what Hamas achieved? Did Hamas win the war for Palestinian memory? You see. 1991, Saddam launched those missiles. This anecdote is 2000. This is where we are now. Anyway, I say this is a fantasy. It's hard to imagine a hot air balloon flying over Jerusalem, but I end with this visual image. And I just wanted to thank you for your attention, spending Tuesday night with me. And now the floor is open to any questions. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Rico. Good seeing you. Thank you, Susie. Good seeing you.
I'm going to pass around a microphone for questions because then folks online can hear your questions and they'll also be recorded. Any questions? Go.
Bye, Hector. Thank you for coming.
Hello, Professor. It was an amazing presentation, by the
Thank
way.
you.
I was very moved by it. I was just having some confusion with the Poway shooter's motivations. Why did he make those decisions?
Yeah, October 7th, the 1-year anniversary of the events. I'm assuming. I basically said it's too early to publish. And think what has happened since then. The fall of the Syrian government. I mean, I would have ideally liked to have published the minute the ceasefire was implemented. Because this brings me back to the necro history. To give an accurate death toll by the time it was published, I had to do a very surreal, macabre math equation. But basically saying, looking at the rate of deaths in Gaza, by the time I publish, this is a pretty sure number that this many people would have died by October 2024. And I hate to say it was, my guess was right. But that also tells you something tragic about the steady rate of deaths. And Fareed Abdul-Noor of San Diego State is, he's really good about talking about, how do we measure death and how do we show sympathy for death. But basically, yeah, I just made a tragic calculation saying, looking at the rate of deaths, this is how many people are going to die by the time the book published. And I didn't want to do that. I did not want to do this. I said, let's just wait. There's no rush in getting published. October 7th is also close to the school year in the UK. They wanted to get the textbook in the hand of the professors. So I think that's why. It sounded nice, October 7th, having it being released, and just the market of academic textbooks. But I knew history, it was too early to publish because history was occurring as I was writing. The last major event I could record was the death of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. That would have been in July 2024, and then I sent it off to the publisher.
Thank you, Professor.
Other questions?
Oh yeah, and the whole war in Lebanon. I mean, that didn't get into the book. The increase of military conflict in Lebanon, I had to skip over.
Hi, I am very undereducated about all the background in this conflict, but I've been trying to catch up.
I have a good book for you too. Give you about, I joke. That was awful. Yes.
I hope you'll sign it for me. Yeah. But I was right from the beginning, October 2023, I was going, why aren't the Arab countries doing anything? Silly me. But recently, I guess they've been standing up, and Elon Mizrahi hypothesizes because unlike all the previous US political leaders, Trump has done no doublespeak. He has just come out and said, will you help me I demand that you help me ethnically cleanse Gaza. And that was apparently a bridge too far. It was that they were not going to, they would do it under the table, they would do all these deals, but they would not come out, and they just couldn't abide by this coarse approach. And what do you think of that?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked the question because I've been alluding to it. So I've been, I've been talking about on two levels of this class. One is kind of the individual writing the book, and then the macro events that were happening. Okay. And again, I've been trying to get us to reinterrogate these categories we use. And one of them is Arab. And I'll put it this way. So just talk on the individual level. On October 7th, I was in Madrid. And you have to understand the protests you have in Madrid are nothing like you would have in the US. I mean, the city of Madrid will shut down its entire downtown to allow the protest to happen. I mean, it's a European capital will just basically say Sunday, the city stops to allow this protest to occur. And what struck me was how many Arab students chose to stay home. Yeah, how many Jewish students came out during those protests? Do you see what I'm saying? I'm saying there's, so I'm just saying, take that from something there was on one level an Arab apathy among some of the students I know. And then there was also, kind of a Jewish solidarity that really touched me. Now let's take this on the regional level. It was a good number of the Arab states simply remained silent during this conflict, right? And I think a good number of them now can come and speak out because with the ceasefire in place, the bullets have stopped, quote unquote. Now they can speak out, you see. So now they're doing it, number one, I think from a position from safety. And number two, now that they know who is the president, right? They know who they're dealing with. And so I think it's that reason. I think it's that reason where, because now for the first time, a demand is being made on Jordan and Egypt. So now they protest, right? Now Saudi Arabia knows where it stands with Trump. So now they know which room they can maneuver in. So, I mean, so to answer your question, it is just, I answer with a very cynical, wait, now they could stand up because it's safe for them to do so, you see. It's safe for them to do so. It's too late. I mean, by the time now with all these objections, this is also, so, I mean, again, let's go back to that anecdote. Saddam Hussein was the only one who ever stood up for us, right? And it's ironic because again, when we look for the war Palestinian memory, I wonder how it will work. So, I mean, number one, so, I mean, if you want to understand the motivation of Hamas, for example, I remember when this book was being finished, the biggest thing that was happening before I sent it off to print was writing about the possibility of Saudi Arabia forging relations with Israel. And if you think, what was that one event that prevented that from happening? It was the events of October 7th. Who was the Saddam since October 7th? It's quite interesting. For the Palestinians who are primarily Arab, Sunni, and Christian, right? It was Shia Persian Iran that struck. It was, who was putting a lot of pressure on Israel's north? It was the Lebanese Arab Shia of Hezbollah. Who else? It was the Zaydi Fiver Shias of Yemen, right? That came to the Palestinian Sunnis' defense. So it's again, like I said, a lot of these categories came dissolving after October 7th, where that category of kind of an Arab solidarity, right? We have to just reinterrogate it, where there was a good number of Arab actors who were apathetic or sat on the sidelines. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you, Professor Marashi.
Thank you, Ali.
Beautiful as always. I wanted to ask about, this morning, President or King of Jordan made a joint conference with Trump, and he accepted the fact that they're at least willing to accept 2,000 sick children, refugees from Gaza. And I was just thinking about the countries that are okay with the new US plan, and there are talks about Somaliland trying to, make the US send people there. And do you think this will be a new tactic to, be on the US's good side, or to get themselves their own legitimization?
I mean, at the end of the day, if you're talking about displacing the people, resettling, I mean, if anything, the last 15 months have showed that these are people who would never leave their homes when bombs are literally falling on their heads. What makes anyone think they're going to now leave? So this is why, I mean, I'm just kind of in shock when I hear of any of this talk. And when you mention what Jordan did, I just have to ask, why wasn't Jordan taking in 2,006 kids earlier? I mean, it's just mind-boggling. I mean, and of course, for Trump, anything that he could claim as a victory, he's going to want to own that. And I think that's what they were doing. But when you mentioned something like this, I was like, yes, why couldn't have that been done in neighboring Egypt or Jordan to begin with? This is how I read these events. So, I mean, sending people to Somaliland, I mean, if they were so, if these people stood in defiance of refusing to leave over the last 15 months, yeah, what makes anyone think that now that there's just a new US president in office that this will happen? But yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Nejla has a question.
Ibrahim, not surprisingly, your presentation was really a tour de force. And even for those of us who come from the region and know some of the history, it was an eye-opener. My question to you, twofold, is first of all, in this country, in the West, maybe not Europe as much, but at least in this country, the knowledge of history of the region is so shallow. And for even policymakers, they probably go back to the establishment of Israel, 1940s, or 1991, the first Gulf War, etc. But there has been a consistent narrative, historical narrative, which was shared by both parties, both administrations over time. We're actually facing a very different moment in history, where history starts in January 2025. I mean, do you see any historical analysis, historical frameworks to the policy of the new administration? Number one. And number two, as a historian, how do you engage on the political and the policy level?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay. Excellent. So I'll answer the last question. That's easier. And I mean, how do you engage? Well, I think I've made that my academic's life mission is, and I have to say, I just attended a very good lecture this morning with Michael Provence, who works on Syria and is a historian. And I think this is something we've had in common, that what we both share in common is history isn't for history's sake, that history needs to inform policy, that any policy has been informed for the failure of appreciating the historical dynamics. If you think about it, when I reached out to you, we've known each other now more for a decade. And I think because I reached out to the Peace Studies program and the Peace School just because of this. This was an institution that could allow me to take my history and give it a policy relevance. I was using history to say bombing Syria is a bad idea in 2013. So I think it's finding the right institutions, the right amount of colleagues that can help you. So whether it was you, Professor Randy Willoughby at Political Science was very good at sponsoring this. That's how I do. And then of course, publishing these kind of pieces, right? With the hope that they're being read. Okay. Now, what's the first question? Okay. It's hard to tell. It's really hard to tell. And I'll tell you why. Again, answering you as a historian is the following. When Trump came to office in 2017, could I have imagined by 2020, people thought we were on the brink of World War III? Could I imagine Trump conducting an assassination of an Iranian general and an Iraqi militia leader on Iraqi soil with such a blatant violation of Iraq's sovereignty? I could have never imagined that. And it's quite surprising. If you remember in 2020, what was the most Googled terms? How did World War I break out? And are we going to start World War III? So with the Trump administration, it's tricky. It's really tricky. With Biden, he was very easy to read. Biden had a long history of where he stood. Biden had a long history of his sympathies. Biden was an open book to read. Biden was a Democrat that was part of the post-1967 US tilt towards Israel after the Six-Day War, and he was very easy to read as a historian. Trump, I can't. But let me say this, another element I did forget to mention in terms of the policy and an individual, which is unprecedented, is the following. I think we have John to thank for this. I remember being a child during the first Intifada of 1987. I remember being in Oxford in 2000 during the second Intifada. I would go back to my alma mater at Georgetown. Never did I ever witness in any of these two previous iterations of this conflict as much sympathy from people not connected to the region. Think about this, where we've had force used to disrupt protests at Columbia to our own UC San Diego. When did any other previous conflict generate this much sympathy amongst just regular Americans of a different generation? I think that's something that has to be acknowledged. And furthermore, I want you to think of the workshops that John has organized. Which previous conflict generated, these workshops only work because you keep on having regular attendance. And no, I don't think any other previous iteration of the conflicts between Palestinians and Israeli has generated this much interest among just a wide swath of the American population. And I think these are all historical dynamics that are important to acknowledge. As somebody who's a historian, but also somebody who's just lived through, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, and now this current conflict. So I guess that's how I would answer the question. Yeah. Yes.
Why now? Especially if you could speak more, why now? Especially for those of us who have very clear memories of this was so scandalous, so taboo. Couldn't even say Palestine. Why now? Where is all this?
That's a really profound question. Okay, so I think there's a couple of dynamics going on here. First of all, think of the everyday's person ability to now connect to that conflict. Okay. In 1987, to learn about the first Intifada, you might get 5 minutes on the 7 o'clock news. And that's it. Maybe some news on the 5th page of the New York Times. And that's it. That was your only connection. During the second Intifada, again, maybe the 24 hours news cycle. Okay. Some newspaper coverage, not in this country. I was living in the UK. The Guardian gave it a lot of coverage. And again, some 24 hours news cycle that, of course, were very biased in terms of One Direction, which is also a bad pun for a music group, I think. Was there one British group called One Direction? Is it? Okay, I wasn't sure because I remember one of its members went in a different direction. I shouldn't make that joke. Anyway, sorry. Think about the 21st century. In other words, the ability to have some kind of empathy with the people enduring this conflict, I think is unprecedented. And I think that has to be a huge factor. You see, I mean, that monopoly on communication really dissolved with social media. Okay. So that you could have people, a woman like Plesty Akkad, a Palestinian, speak to a global audience through her Instagram account. Bisan, I mean, all these personalities that we could have followed that despite, again, mainstream media usually fall in this column that I mentioned. And I think that did a lot to raise awareness and generate empathy that couldn't have happened normally. And then, also the world has changed. I mean, the world has changed. This is a generation that went through, remembers the death of George Floyd and was transformed. I think it's a generation that's a lot more sympathetic. It's a generation that I hope, and this is what I see, that sees, both climate change and what's, all these conflicts as connected. And I think that's how I'd answer the why now. Yeah.
I want to start by saying thank you so much for this presentation. I love your energy, your presence, and obviously all the information that you presented.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I don't know. It might be because I'm close to the camera. Anyways, going off of that discussion and that question that we just had, while this has been generating like a lot of empathy and also, I guess, knowledge on the subject, where are we drawing the line between like the use of social media and desensitizing the public from everything that's happening, and then also like performative activism on social media? Because like I would like to say that at least Gen Z, because we were so active on, let's say, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, we were getting a lot of like on the ground news from the reporters. But then I would see like older generations, let's say like my parents or my grandparents, who were getting, I don't know, MSNBC, Fox News, and they're getting another narrative. So they were still very much like on the fear and worry side of the conflict, while we were very much like on the angry. But then slowly, I want to say like over the summer, people just kind of started reposting and liking, and I think we're like disconnecting ourselves from like the severity of the conflict. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's the other, you're asking a profound question. And, I was mentioning Yusra Mardini on Netflix, but there's also a very important Netflix series you have to watch that also kind of answers your question. And it uses this as a metaphor. Sure, when you go scrolling at the end of the day, but when the phone goes black, right? You're looking at yourself in a distorted black mirror. And the whole series, Black Mirror, is asking this question. We're going to be engaged, but then after a while, is there a certain overload, or will there be another conflict that we get distracted by? And I'll just give you an interesting analogy. I remember when October 7th happened, I was like, okay, not only is our attention going to be refocused, but then everyone was looking at Ukraine right before that. Now, when I say that, I'm saying, what would it take? Would there be another conflict then that would distract? Now, I want you to remember World War III. We thought it would break out. And why didn't it not break out? Because of COVID. In other words, were the tensions between Iran and the US still there? Yes, but all attention shifted on the virus, you see. So what you're talking about is what's called the attention economy, right? And that's what you're saying. When you're saying, are we, going to get desensitized? There's only so much attention we can put, right? And I'll just give you the answer. Ukrainians, after a while, said, you know what? Of course, a good number of them living abroad or living in Ukraine. So they're saying, we're tired of our war. We're tired of following war. Even I'm getting desensitized to the news, you see. So if it's going to happen on that level, I mean, the question you're asking is, you're absolutely right, because sure, it could connect, sure, it could mobilize, but it could also desensitize at the same time. And yeah, the whole point of that series is, yeah, for a good number of us, what we're seeing there is suffering, but through a pixelated screen, you see. And I mean, you mentioned it perfectly, because literally as you're asking that question, I was thinking about Gen Z and all of this. And so everything you asked, I had just thought about, literally as I ended that question. And yeah, I really don't have an answer for you. I just can observe and say, that's a really good question based on, society's relationship with social media.
Hello, thank you again for your presentation. I was wondering, with the new idea of monopolizing the Gaza Strip and turning it into this the real estate empire in a way with the new administration, how would you appeal to these leaders in order for this not to happen? I mean, obviously, morally, we can say that it's completely desensitizing, dehumanizing, and wiping out a whole nation and a history, but our new administration is looking at this fiscally. So how would you appeal to them in this case?
I mean, by not, basically, I think of it this way. It's just one of Trump's most recent distractions. I mean, just like with the Muslim ban got, slowly lost its impact after a while. It was just something to distract, to mobilize. He likes to polarize, to mobilize. And I think this is the way he's going to do it until he gets distracted by his next foreign policy crisis. I mean, like I just said earlier, he could want to make it, like the casinos on Jersey Shore. But at the end of the day, there's, more than 2 million people who will never let that happen. And I think they're the ones you're going to have to ask. And they're the ones who will never let it happen. And so, I mean, so you could, yeah, you could have this president use all the bluster he wanted. First of all, I think he's just using a point to polarize at the end of the day. I don't think he's ever had any plan for the Middle East that's ever been realistic to begin with. So, I mean, to be honest, yeah, in response to this is, why should we not focus on this? Because it just provides cover. Well, the real conflict is now brewing in the West Bank, you see. That's why. That's a slow conflict that really needs to be paid attention to in places like Jenin. And so that's why I say all of this bluster over Gaza is this Trump talking his real estate talk, but it also distracts and gives kind of a cover for saying, okay, if Gaza does not become a waterfront, Mediterranean Riviera, then fine, Netanyahu, do what you want in what you call Judea and Samaria. And I think that's the real problem. That's the real problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
We don't have any more questions, but if I may ask you maybe to go back to that oxymoron of historians reflecting on the future. And to follow up on what was just said and what you just said, where will the West Bank be a year from February 2026 or a year from now?
That's, more dissected, more carved up, more thirsty, more deprived of water. And I'm just going to answer this to give a segue to the next lecture on water. In July 2023, after doing a really long study that I published, on the water situation in Gaza, I more or less came with this conclusion. How can a population that is so thirsty not lash out in some way? And I got the answer on October 2023, you see. Okay. So just to set up the next question, where do I see it? Again, this is a piece of territory that has the same problems: access to water, access to work, access to livelihoods, only getting worse. Only getting worse. This is what I see it, is that with all the attention that focus on Gaza, and again, with these words, attention economy, I think the Israeli government is also banking on the attention economy. In other words, the world had enough of Gaza. If we do it more quieter and, if we work more quietly and slowly in the West Bank, piecemeal, bit by bit, it's not going to generate that much attention. I mean, really, that's been the story of the West Bank, even since October 7th, 2023. So again, it's hard to predict, but this is what I'm seeing now, and I don't see any stop to it. This is the scary thing. This kind of slow, piecemeal attrition, and this is the only way to describe it. It's just a slow attritional strategy in the West Bank, with really no political actor that's strong enough to stop it. I mean, the Palestinian Authority, doesn't really have, what power do they have, particularly with the Trump administration, to stop this from happening?
Thank you, Ibrahim, for
My pleasure.
a wonderful, multi-layered, brilliantly delivered lecture.